All rise. Veuillez vous lever.
Presiding Judge. The hearing rather, is in session. Good morning, good afternoon rather, to one and all. Once again, I'd like to have confirmation that there's no change in the staffing of the parties and the participants.
Monsieur le Président, l'équipe est identique.
We have an unchanged team, says the prosecution. Presiding Judge, no change. Oh, I see, because the prosecutor is sitting on one of the back benches. Ms. Taylor?
Thank you very much. Ms. Chala is not here for this session. Thank you.
Presiding Judge. That's right, so that should feature on the transcript.
Mr.
Duterte, over to you, sir, to resume the opening of the prosecution. Over to you, sir. Mr. Duterte, my thanks, Your Honour, honourable members of the bench. A small point. I'll be using 5 slides from a PowerPoint presentation, so in due course I'll be asking of the court officer to give me leave to switch on to evidence 2, in all likelihood, to disseminate this public material. Court officer, evidence 2 has indeed been allocated to you, counsel.
C'est parfait.
Presiding Judge, please continue, counsel. Prosecution, my thanks, Your Honour. Your Honour, honourable members of the bench, Al-Hasan is before you today for one single reason. His was a pivotal role in the oppression to which the Timbuktu population was made victim from the entire period from April 2012 through to January 2013. He was key to the repressive system established by Ansar Din and Acme in and around the city. He actively participated in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity inflicted on its inhabitants. And by crimes, I notably refer to torture, inhumane acts, as well as persecution on religious grounds and persecution directed against women and young girls. The hard reality is that Al-Hasan was the commissioner of the Islamic police. That very Islamic police was itself one of the principal organs of the system of control established by Ansar Din and Acme to bring the Timbuktu men, women, girls and boys under their power. That police was in the vanguard to control and monitor, repress, sanction and arrest the inhabitants and have them submit to both their dictates and prohibitions through violent and brutal physical punishment. Al-Hasan was the driving force within the Islamic police during the occupation. True, there was an Emir appointed to the Islamic police, Adjourn, followed by Khaled Abu Suleiman. But Al-Hasan held a vital role in the assignments and operations of said police. It was he who ran the police on a daily basis. It was he who played a major role in the police's interactions with the other organs of the repressive apparatus, particularly with regard to the irregularly constituted Islamic court, First and foremost, it must be said, within this ambit, Al-Hasan was a direct perpetrator and contributed to the commission of other crimes he is charged with. I shall soon address you on that matter, Your Honours, Honourable Member of the Bench, but to better understand the backdrop against which Al-Hasan committed these crimes, allow me first to return you to those few weeks and months prior to Timbuktu's fall into the hands of the armed groups Ansar Dine and Acme. It is 2011. The world watches as Colonel Gaddafi falls. Many armed groups in the sub-region use this opportunity to better equip their military arsenal thanks to the looting of Libyan arms dumps and the weapons trafficking that it triggered. One such group was Acme, a very well-known terrorist group. Another was Ansar Dine, a Malian armed group formed at the end of 2011 to defend, as they claimed, religion. In this context, the 17th of January 2012, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad launched an attack on the Menaka military camp in northeast Mali. This sparked an armed conflict of a non-international nature on Mali's soil. Clashes began to multiply, particularly in Agolok and Tessalit. Within 3 months, the northeast of Mali, making up 2/3 of its national territory, passed under the total control of the armed groups, and especially that of Ansar Dine, Acme, and the Movement for Unification and Jihad in West Africa, otherwise known as Mujahid. Kidal fell on 30th of March 2012 to Ansar Dine. Gao fell on 31st of March 2012 under the control of the MNLA, quickly evinced by Mujahid. The following day, the 1st of April 2012, Timbuktu, a major city in West Africa, falls into the hands of Ansar Dine and Acme. Everyone will recall pictures of pickups bristling with black flags and heavy weapons rising from nowhere out of the desert and parading in triumph in the streets of Timbuktu. An easy victory, it must be said, since the Malian army, traumatized and terrorized by the bloody massacre of prisoners of war at Agolok, had abandoned the city. The reign of Ansar Dine and Acme would hold sway until January 2013, when they were ultimately dislodged, particularly by members of Operation Serval. With your leave, Your Honours, at this juncture of my submissions, I would like to refer you to screenshots. There you have it, a first screenshot, which shows us the armed groups in Timbuktu. Behind, we can see the Sheikh Grand Mosque. You picked that out in the background, Your Honours. And on the subsequent screenshot, what do we see? We see the type of military equipment that these groups could use in Timbuktu. This is what the inhabitants of Timbuktu were up against. This gives you an inkling into what we're dealing with here, honourable members of the bench. Ansar Dine and Acme, Your Honours, made no secret whatsoever of their intentions and objectives once they had entered the city of Timbuktu. As soon as the city fell, Iyad Ag-Khali, founder and leader of Ansar Dine, I've already mentioned that, immediately announced that he was now the city's new master. He stated that his organization henceforth represented the public authority and the law. Iyad Ag-Khali made clear, above all, that any conduct infringing their rules would be punished, and that the offenders would have, I quote, problems with him and his group, end of quote. This comes through the witness P0125, Your Honours. In parallel, the words of Sander Oud Boumama, Ansardine spokesman, are unambiguous regarding what Iyad Ag Khali understood by problems, in inverted commas. Sander says in Timbuktu, and here I quote, "I know we shall be cutting off hands. We shall also be cutting off heads if the Sharia stipulates so. We have no qualms about that." End of quote. The members of Ansardine and Acme in Timbuktu are therefore clearly guided by a common plan, a common objective. Their objective is to cement their power and control of the city, its environs, and the civilian population, and to impose their personal, ideological, and religious views on said civilian population. And this by all means possible, Your Honours, including conduct, acts, and measures which, in the normal course, resulted in serious breaches of the fundamental rights of the inhabitants and in the commission of acts of violence and crimes charged in the instant case. To fulfill their ends, Ansardine and Acme swiftly established in Timbuktu organs for decision-making, control, and repression. At the top of the hierarchy, we have the emirate, or the presidency. It comprised three individuals, Abu Zaid, Yayu Abu Al-Haman, and Abdallah al-Chingeti. Abu Zaid, an Algerian. He was a very long-standing member of Acme and battalion commander, Tariq ibn Zayed. Ibak Ag Khali introduced him as the new governor of Timbuktu. Yahya Abu Al-Aman, also an Algerian, head of Acme's Al-Furqan battalion. He would later become Acme's Emir for the Sahel as a whole. And lastly, Abdallah al-Chingeti from Mauritania. He was a spiritual leader, member of Acme's Al-Furqan battalion, and he would eventually become its commander. These three individuals, Your Honours, are now all deceased. But in 2012, they comprised the presidency. The presidency ran the city on a daily basis, while Iyad Ag Khali, often from his base in Kidal, retained control over what was happening in Timbuktu, particularly through his regular visits on site. Below the presidency, Your Honours, we find various organs, including the Islamic Court, the Hezbollah, also called the Vice Squad, the security battalions, the media office, the religious committee, the training centers, and above all, for our purposes, the Islamic police, first housed in the Mali Solidarity Bank, called BMS, and then in the governor's office. The court will hear evidence giving you detailed insight into all these institutions that we referred to as organs in our pre-trial brief. Taken together with the armed groups Ansardine and Acme in Timbuktu, we have what it can be described as the organization. New institutions, therefore, Your Honours, in a word, responsible for imposing by force the public authorities' power and the religious ideology of Ansardine and Acme, but with the essential assistance from local people. Indeed, Ansardine and Acme, largely made up of foreigners and non-natives of Timbuktu, take care in appointing to these organs the few members in their ranks who are indeed native to that region. They needed them. Their goal was to lend local color to their work. Their goal was also to be fully operational through people who had sound knowledge of the place, the region, their inhabitants, and their languages. Hence, Huka, as de facto president of the Islamic Court. Hence, Al-Mahdi and Mohammed Musa, as each in turn leaders of the Hezbollah. Hence, Abu Talha, who leads the security battalion. Hence, Sander Ould Boumana acted as a spokesman for the groups. Hence, also, Al-Hasan, who became the Islamic Police Commissioner. All of these people are native to Timbuktu and its region. Most are, for that matter, from the very same tribe as the accused. All these people, including Al-Hasan, are members of the common plan and adhere to the common goal of these groups. Within this context, Your Honours, it's crucial to understand three things. First, these organs work in close conjunction, particularly the Islamic Court, the Islamic Police and the Hezbollah. These were demonstrably the three most active organs in the persecution of the local population. Second, I reiterate, the Islamic Police was itself the most heavily deployed organ on the ground and the most involved in the repressive apparatus. Third, Al-Hasan, as commissioner, held a pivotal role. I move to illustrate, using examples, how these organs coordinated amongst each other. This coordination was sought by so-called Governor Abu Zaid. He gave instructions on 15th of August 2012 regarding how to react in cases of infringement by the local population of the new rules and prohibitions. He addressed these instructions to all, to the Islamic police officers, to members of the Hezbollah, and more broadly to all the members of the armed groups. The message was clear. It was a collective enterprise. Everyone was involved to make sure that these dictates and prohibitions were properly abided by. This coordination was translated into practice on the ground through various ways. The accused, for example, stated that the police assisted the Hezbollah in patrols and that sometimes they patrolled in unison. It was notably during these patrols that local people were arrested. Indeed, once arrested, the person was, in the vast majority of cases, questioned by the police, who then drew up a report and referred the case as appropriate to the Islamic Court. This latter entered a conviction on the basis of said report. Punishment was therefore meted out particularly by the police. In point of fact, Al-Hasan lay at the heart of this apparatus. My learned friends Diane Looping and Musa Alafi will expand on that point further, Your Honours, for it perfectly illustrates the linkage between the Islamic police on the one hand and the Islamic court on the other, as well as the substantial contribution of Al-Hasan in this regard. A brief parenthesis, Your Honours, which echoes what the prosecutor mentioned this morning. This court goes by the name the Islamic Court, in inverted commas. This name was in fact given by the armed groups themselves. Here I make no criticism of Islamic courts that may exist elsewhere. What is here being prosecuted in the instant case, Your Honours, is the manner in which these armed groups, Ansar-Din and Acme, established that court and the manner in which it operated on the ground. That tribunal provided no guarantee of impartiality whatsoever, Your Honours. Abdullah al-Chingeti, a member of the presidency, I've always made mention of him, in other words, the executive branch, if you will, sat on that court and wielded very considerable influence. That tribunal in no way, in no shape or form, complied with the most basic procedural guarantees. It approved, for example, the use of torture as a method of questioning. It is, put simply, an irregularly constituted tribunal. No more, no less. I end my parenthesis, Your Honours, and I return to the cooperation between the organs. Within this tight collaboration, the evidence will show that the Islamic police had a prominent role, held a privileged position. This must be recognized. This reading flows from numerous non-exhaustive aspects. The Islamic police was the first organ to be established. After being housed on the BMS's premises, the police moved to the governor's office building. This move is very telling. It is symbolically significant. Compare with the Islamic court, which operated at a hotel or in a private house. The police had more staff than the Hezbollah. Witness 0122 specifies that it was more than 30 members strong, whilst the Hezbollah only had 10 members, according to another witness. The police was also heavily equipped with weapons, unlike the Hezbollah, whose members went mostly unarmed, hence the joint patrols. This information comes directly to us from the accused himself, Your Honours. The police also had vehicles and motorbikes, and here again we know that the Hezbollah was less well equipped. This comes from the statements of an insider. The police was omnipresent. It affected patrols everywhere in Timbuktu and its environs, armed with Kalashnikovs and whips with which to beat civilians. This you will see in video material as the trial unfolds. They even travelled as far as Kabara, Lear and Gundam, hundreds of kilometres away from Timbuktu. The police officers were basically everywhere, in the street, in the market, in the schools, and even in inhabitants' private dwellings. And this night and day. It was also the police which was, as a point of principle, responsible for making arrests. Mr. Al-Hasan specifies that if the Hezbollah encountered anyone violating the rules, the Hezbollah was rule-bound to call the police, who would then go to the place in question, make the arrest, and take the offender into custody. It was the police who questioned and drew up reports. The proof is in the pudding. We found more than 70 police reports, and only 2 authored by the Hezbollah, Your Honours. The police also responsible for meting out punishments and managing the prison. A non-exhaustive list, Your Honours, of the preeminence of that organ. I spoke of weapons and ammunition, but images and pictures are sometimes more eloquent than words. So I refer you to these police patrols and what they look like through 3 screenshots, Your Honours. If the computer wishes to play ball. On this first screenshot, we see 2 members of the police force patrolling with their vehicles, following with a police officer on his motorbike. Here, you can see they are armed with weapons of war. We can see a Kalashnikov, which is just poking up above the left shoulder of the police officer to the left of your screen, Your Honour. We also see their blue vest, where we see Islamic police written on it. And on another screenshot, Your Honours, what we see is that the ammunition that they carried with them are war weapon ammunition. This is what applied law in Timbuktu upon the inhabitants in the day, Your Honours. This is what was travelling around the Timbuktu roads and streets. Within this ambit, Your Honours, Mr. Al-Hasan himself played a major role within the Islamic police. We know that the accused did indeed join the ranks of Ansar-Din. The evidence will bear this out. He even confirmed it himself, Your Honours. However, he joined much earlier than he in fact claims. Madam Prosecutor has raised this point. My learned friend Diane Luping will revisit this point in detail. Very quickly, Al-Hasan became the linchpin within the Islamic police. At the time, in Timbuktu, the inhabitants knew that he was the commissioner. The members of the armed groups saw him as such. He also acts as such, Your Honours. And years after the material time, he confirmed to witness P0605 that he was the commissioner. So he became Islamic police commissioner, a police force set up by Acme and Ansardine. He became so because he espoused these groups' views, Your Honours. And these are terrorist groups. Such groups don't hand out willy-nilly such a position of responsibility, such as police commissioner of an entire city under their total control. To be so appointed, they must know you and trust you implicitly. Additionally, the evidence that you shall hear throughout the trial will leave no doubt whatsoever that Mr. Al-Hasan agreed to the common plan and the common goal, which clearly existed as soon as the city fell to their control. This emerges, as you will see, through his acts and conduct during the material time. This emerges from what he said in Timbuktu in 2012, and we have recordings of what he said. This emerges, for example, from the quantum of telephone calls between Al-Hasan and the other members of the common plan. You will hear experts address you on this matter, P0587 and P0617, who will be addressing this matter in their expert evidence, Your Honour. Not only did Mr. Al-Hasan join the common plan and goal, he was among the core members who, on a daily basis, sustained it. He wasn't the governor of Timbuktu. He wasn't the Emir of Acme for the Sahel. But in the city, and even beyond its walls, he belonged to those essential people in a position of responsibility, Your Honours, who sustained day in, day out, the common plan, who sustained the common goal throughout the 10 months occupation of Timbuktu. And you'll see on a video, for example, you'll see him doing his work, giving instructions to patrolling police officers at Liri, very far away from Timbuktu. I move now to acts of violence and abuses, Your Honours. They were often, they were held in public. This was a typical feature of the modus operandi and the objectives of the organization at Timbuktu. An example, the first flogging. It took place on the 20th of June 2012 on the main central Sankori Square. A couple was whipped for what the group saw as an instance of adultery. The entire population was marshalled onto the square. It was an opportunity for Ansardine and Acme to flex their muscles, to offer their first example of public punishment, to imprint it on people's minds, to intimidate, and more broadly to terrorize. Everything was put on film. We see clearly on these videos that the inhabitants do not rejoice at this cruel spectacle. Consequently, its violence was twofold. It was physical and psychological for its two unfortunate victims who suffered pain and everlasting shame. It was also psychological for the entire population who was subjected to this pitiful sight, which flew in the face of their values and way of life. When you see your wife, when you see your daughter, when you see your mother beaten, and you can do absolutely nothing to stop it, you are yourself humiliated, belittled, diminished. The entire population, made powerless, was collectively humiliated, trodden underfoot in the face of heavily armed tormentors against whom they could try nothing, attempt nothing, do nothing, Your Honours. On the 20th of June 2012, the message was abundantly clear. Any violation of the rules would unleash a merciless response. The inhabitants lived, therefore, for several long months with a nagging fear that they themselves may become physical victims. From June 20th 2012, public punishment and acts of violence grew in number. The local population didn't feel that Ansardine and Acme sought to make them better people. Not at all. The population, essentially Muslim, had seen that their fundamental rights were being trampled underfoot and seriously prejudiced. They saw themselves as targeted, attacked, persecuted, victims of a systematic, widespread attack. This is what makes this case so very serious. Madam Prosecutor has given you one or two examples of violence, but the police could stop you in the street and punish you on the spot. Women were brutalized on the spot, forced marriage, even rapes, and children suffered rapes. They were called children of the ICC for want of an identifiable father. The list of criminal acts committed during this reign of tyranny is long. In a YouTube video, an inhabitant from Timbuktu, this dates back to the 30th of June 2012, I quote, "Timbuktu is on the brink of losing its soul. Timbuktu is under peril of outrage and ruin. Timbuktu sees held against its throat the razor-edged blade of cold-blooded murder." End of quote. Timbuktu went through a terrible period. This is the things that they had to face, Your Honours. Your Honours, Al-Hasan must be held responsible for the alleged crimes. The prosecution shall prove his responsibility beyond reasonable doubt for either his personal and direct commission of the crimes, where he appears, for example, on film flogging poor victims in public and inflicting on them intense pain, or that he contributed to the commission of said crimes by, for example, supplying the irregularly constituted Islamic court with the reports on the basis of which punishment was ordered. More generally, the evidence will show that Al-Hasan contributed in manifold ways to the commission of crimes by the group involved in the common plan and that should be held criminally responsible, Your Honours. The prosecution has a vast body of evidence. We have videos depicting Al-Hasan in action. We have police reports written and signed by the accused. We have judgments returned by the Islamic court signed by Huka. We have witness statements, Your Honours. We have victim statements. We have insider statements. And reams of medical expertise, ballistic experts' reports, experts addressing authenticity of documents, experts on handwriting and signatures, expertise on voice identification, an expert's report on facial identification, an expert in telephone data on satellite imagery. This entire body of evidence will be placed before you as the trial unfolds, Your Honours. Of course, we shall have to factor in the COVID pandemic. The prosecution cannot call witnesses in the order we would have liked in order to present the evidence in a coherent and organised fashion. We had to prioritise travel requirements and ability to travel. But all in all, Your Honours, the prosecution will ultimately prove beyond a reasonable doubt the crimes committed and the criminal responsibility of the accused in their commission. Your Honour, honourable members of the bench, the inhabitants of Timbuktu thirst for justice. They seek to drink to the lees the warm and soothing milk of truth. They are pinning every hope on the judgment that you will be rendering at the close of this trial, Your Honours. I now give way to Diane Looping, my learned friend, who will enter into the finer detail of the abuses and conduct of Mr. Al-Hasan within the Islamic police. I thank you, Your Honour. Presiding Judge, thank you very much, Mr. Prosecutor Duterte. I now hand over to Ms. Looping. You have the floor, Counsel.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Your Honours. I will be addressing the topic of Mr. Al-Hasan's role and functions within the organisation. Just a technical point for information of the court officer. All of the slides that I'll be presenting may be broadcast publicly, and I would ask if I could please be given the floor to present the slides already.
You have the floor, Ms. Looping.
Thank you, Court Officer. Your Honours, as the de facto commissaire of the Islamic police, Al-Hasan was a key player, a key implementer and enforcer of the organisation's power and its rules. What was his role? Well, he was responsible for the daily management, organisation and work of the police, as well as for the investigations and prosecutions of numerous cases against civilians for violations of the organization's imposed new rules. And what was his impact? All of his acts and conduct had an impact on nearly every aspect of the local population's lives and contributed to the crimes committed against them. His work supported the coercive and persecutory environment in Timbuktu. Your Honours, I will address three key points. First, Al-Hasan's impact as the key face and interface of the police with the local population. Secondly, the intentional, voluntary nature of the work that he did and the timing of when he carried out that work. And third, his core functions. First, in terms of Al-Hasan's impact on the local population, they had no choice but to engage with him. In his role and exercise of his functions, he was the key face, the key interface of the police with the local population. In particular, Al-Hasan actively imposed the rules on the local population during his patrols, at the police headquarters, during his investigations of the many cases of violations of their rules, and in civil disputes, during his arrests, summons, detention, and interrogations of individuals who were subjected to violence, torture, and severe sanctions. In the cases that he referred to the Islamic Tribunal, when he brought suspects to the tribunal, when he executed punishments against them. He was the leader writing and signing police investigation reports concerning the people, and he could sign permits issued to them, affecting different aspects of their daily lives. His reports on cases involving the population had an impact on the tribunal judgments as the judges relied on his reports. Al-Hasan was the person that the local population consistently saw in their mediations and disputes. The groups chose Al-Hasan to be a spokesman during interviews, to spread their propaganda, supporting the organization in imposing their own rules, their punishment against the local population. Al-Hasan also acted on behalf of his men in their personal interactions with the local population, in so-called marriage negotiations, and in requesting dowries on their behalf. And it was Al-Hasan's personal phone number displayed on the Islamic police headquarters sign for people to call. Sorry, Your Honours, just one moment, please. I have to ask for a court officer's assistance, as there seems to be a technical problem with the slides. I'm having to do it manually. It seems to be working now, Your Honours. So if we just turn to the first slide, we have the facade of the Islamic police. And in the red box, you will be able to see the accused's phone number. It's the very first number on the sign. And you will hear evidence. You will see call data records. And there is also the evidence from the accused himself confirming that this was the accused's number and that this sign hung from the police headquarters from April 2012. Al-Hasan was at the very heart of this repressive system, and he was involved at different stages of its functioning. Al-Hasan's role and his functions as the de facto commissaire and key interface with the population was common knowledge in Timbuktu. You will hear witnesses confirm this, including those who knew him well. You'll hear from victims and eyewitnesses, journalists and insiders alike. And Al-Hasan introduced himself as the commissaire, or the person responsible for the police, to individuals, such as witnesses P113, P984, P605, and journalist 623. One witness, a former member of the Islamic police, and one of Al-Hasan's subordinates explained, and I quote, and this is in French, La police là-bas.
The police there. The person in charge is the commissioner. Everything that's done at the police, the person in charge is the commissioner.
Al-Hasan explained, and I quote, again in French, Mon rôle, c'est le rôle.
My role is the role of the police.
Al-Hasan was a logical choice for the groups. He was the right man at the right place at the right time. He came from Timbuktu, so he was well known to the local population. He spoke their local languages as well as French and Arabic. He was an educated man. He was a Tuareg and a member of the influential Kel Ansar tribe. He was trusted by the other leaders as he shared their ideological, religious, and political views. He had regular access to the senior leadership, and he was in constant communication with them, and they entrusted responsibilities to him. The organization's target was the civilian population of Timbuktu region, and the many victims of this case whom Al-Hasan's contributions have impacted upon included, for example, women and girls arrested for their dress code violations, who were then detained in harsh and inhumane conditions, many of whom were subjected to sexual violence. Jadeo Maiga, whom you heard, Al-Hasan himself arrested, whose hand was then publicly amputated following a judgment of the tribunal. You'll hear evidence from P580, also arrested by Mr. Al-Hasan, who was severely beaten, tortured, and illegally detained, and victims whom the accused flogged for drinking alcohol. Al-Hasan was a willing perpetrator and member of this organization from the very outset, who believed in their vision, their shared ideology, religious and political vision of the organization, which they invoked to impose their power and their rules. He fully embraced his role and functions within the police in enforcing these new rules on the population and to impose their power from the early days of the occupation until his departure from Timbuktu in January 2013. When did Al-Hasan join? He was a permanent key pillar of the police. Al-Hasan was a member of the organization and the groups at all times relevant to the charges in this case. In particular, he was a member of Ansardine. He joined and he worked at the police as soon as it was put in place from April 2012. Unlike the police Emir, Adama, and Khalid, he kept his same role as the commissaire within the police from when he first started in that role, from at least the 7th of May 2012 at the latest, and continued with that role throughout the occupation. It was Al-Hasan who provided continuity for the police. You will hear evidence from witness 150, who describes 2 stages of the work of the police, covering the whole period of the charges. He describes a first stage, when the policing was being done in the streets, and a second stage with a more formal structure with a headquarters. And P150 confirms that, and I quote, "In each stage, Hassan was there," end of quote. Witness 150 also confirmed that Al-Hasan was already doing duties and tasks such as sending patrols, and I quote, "at an early stage when the groups arrived in Timbuktu," end of quote. You will hear evidence from insider witness P99, who stated, and I quote in French, "Et le second de la police
And the second in charge of the Islamic police was still that Tuareg. He didn't change.
You will see documentary evidence, for example, in an Islamic tribunal judgment and corresponding report that confirms that the accused was carrying out his functions as de facto commissaire from at least the 7th of May 2012. You will hear eyewitnesses who saw Al-Hasan at the Banque Malienne de Solidarité, or the BMS, which became the headquarters of the police in the first days of the occupation in April 2012. He had his office there, and again later at the Gouvernorat when the police moved. You will see videos that show him in his office at the BMS and later again in his office at the Gouvernorat. There is an article dated the 28th of April 2012, which refers to the fact that the Islamic police headquarters was formally set up and already had a sign at that headquarters the day before, on the 27th of April. I've shown you that photograph that had the accused's personal phone number already on it. And you will hear evidence that this was a number that Al-Hasan had for years before the occupation and that he continued to use during and after the occupation. From the very start, Al-Hasan voluntarily signed up to the organization's goals and what it did. In this next slide, Your Honours will see a screenshot from a video interview conducted with the accused in November 2012. And this is a shot from when he responded to a question about the salaries of the Islamic police that they received for their work. And he responded, and I quote, "It is for the sake of Allah's cause," end of quote. And in this very same video interview, when he was asked about the work of the police, he explained that it, and I quote, "it involves patrols within the town and correcting objectionable acts. Any type of reprehensible act which has been forbidden, we correct, such as drinking alcohol, smoking, and a woman adorning herself, and other such acts," end of quote. Again, in the same interview, Al-Hasan explains that the groups were applying punishments, such as cutting off the hand of a thief, executing a murderer, and flogging of others. And he said that after imposing these punishments, and I quote, "alcohol-related cases have stopped. We don't have any at all. And the same goes for theft too," end of quote. The evidence will show that Mr. Al-Hasan, like other senior leaders, was willing to be hands-on to get the job done. They led by example. You will hear from witness P65 how the execution of a sentence was considered holy, and taking part in punishments made members of the groups feel proud, so that the leaders would also do that. For instance, Al-Hasan and other leaders, such as the Islamic Tribunal members, Radwan and Qutayba, would personally flog victims. The top spiritual guide, Al-Chingeti, helped to destroy the Sidi Yahya door. Tala, the head of the security battalions, Al-Mahdi, the head of Hezbollah, Al-Bara, a preacher, they all also helped in destroying the mausoleums. As you have already heard, Al-Hasan knew full well that these punishments were being imposed on the inhabitants and they weren't previously known to them. He explicitly said it was the first time that they were seeing these punishments and there was nothing that they could do about it, that they were all scared of these punishments. He said they feared the word jihadists and terrorists. Similarly, in a message dated the 20th of July, 2012, Drukdel, who was a senior ACME leader based outside of Mali, sent a message to fellow ACME and Ansarudine leaders in Mali, cautioning them, saying to them, don't be too hasty in applying these laws. He stated that it was, and I quote, an environment that is ignorant of religion and a people which has not applied Sharia in centuries. He went further. It's worth noting that at this stage, just because a small class of people have accepted our understanding of applying Sharia does not mean that all sections of the people have accepted it, end of quote. Your Honours, I now turn to Al-Hasan's core functions. And these were to organize the work of the police and his work in investigations, prosecutions, and the punishment of Timbuktu's inhabitants. First, the evidence will show that Al-Hasan ensured the daily management and organization of the work of the police. As Al-Hasan himself explained, and I quote, Il organisait le travail de la police.
He organized the work of the police.
As you have heard from my colleague, Mr. Duterte, the Islamic police was a key organ at the center of the organization's repressive apparatus. And the police was visible and active everywhere within Timbuktu city and other localities in the region, such as Lere, Bear, and Goundam. And you've heard they were everywhere, including at checkpoints, streets, markets, and even in people's homes. The police were monitoring the population and they forced them to follow their rules, their prohibitions in every part of their lives. You've heard that this included a dress code that forced women to cover themselves up, rules that stopped men and women mingling with one another, that stopped men and women choosing if they wanted to have sex outside of marriage, that stopped people practicing their own religion, stopped them from listening to what music they wanted to hear, to smoke, to drink alcohol. It was the police who pursued, stopped, arrested, detained, and beat people that they found violating their rules. And it was Al-Hasan who was the leader right from the start, dispatching the police there and assigning and tasking them to do this. And he worked closely with other leaders, both within the police and other organs, to coordinate all of this persecutory work. Al-Hasan started sending out patrols from an early stage when the groups first arrived in Timbuktu. he chose members of the police to send on patrol. He gave his subordinates instructions and orders, for example, to send them out on patrols, which he also participated in. And he gave them other tasks, such as what positions to take during the women's demonstration. You'll hear evidence of this demonstration. This was when women of Timbuktu rose up to demonstrate against their ill treatment. Your Honours, in this next slide, again you can see Mr. Al-Hasan, and he's using a walkie-talkie and mobile phone to communicate and give instructions about thieves that had been arrested in Bear. Mr. Al-Hasan could also punish and discipline his investigations. I now turn to the second core function of Mr. Al-Hasan, and that was in the enforcement and implementation of the enforced rules by his handling of multiple cases of the violations of the rules and his mediation of civil disputes. Al-Hasan played a pivotal role in police investigations of the civilians who violated the organization's imposed rules. It was Al-Hasan who was involved in every stage of the cases that resulted in punishments. He was involved at the arrests, summons, detention, investigations, interrogations, judgments, and the execution of sanctions. Al-Hasan could summons and arrest suspects. And Your Honours, in this next slide, you will see an example of a summons that has been signed by Al-Hasan. And in the area with a red box, you will see his signature. Al-Hasan conducted interrogations as part of these investigations. He could even question other leaders during these investigations. This included Adama, the Emir of the police, Abu Talha, the leader of the security battalions. And during these interrogations, Al-Hasan used methods that included threats of violence, and torture. You will hear witnesses, including victims and other eyewitnesses, who will testify to this. You will also see documentary evidence that shows that the police used torture. Al-Hasan also confirmed that torture took place during police interrogations of suspects. He wrote investigation reports following his investigations, a number of which were referred to the Islamic Tribunal. And I show one example in the next slide. For instance, in this report, dated the 16th of July, 2012, Al-Hasan mentioned that the suspect, and I quote, was interrogated and tortured, but to no avail. And you can also see his signature on this report, along with a stamp of the Islamic police. Tellingly, the Islamic police investigation reports in the possession of the prosecution that were found at the BMS and the Hôtel La Maison, where the tribunal was based, were written and they were submitted by Al-Hasan. These reports are in his handwriting and many bear his signature. And the fact that this is his handwriting and his signature will be supported by evidence that you will hear, including from handwriting experts, P657 and P620, insiders, P150 and P626. And this was also confirmed by the accused himself. Al-Hasan's signatures on these reports was sufficient for police matters. Your Honours, I now turn to another example of a police investigation report that was signed by the accused. It's dated the 23rd of May, 2012. And at the very bottom, he signs as investigator. This is a close-up of the designation investigator and of his signature. The evidence will also show that Al-Hasan had the power and authority to investigate cases outside of Timbuktu city, as shown by examples of cases in Lere, Gaundam, Nyafunke, Goma Rarus, and other localities in Timbuktu region. And he could order that suspects be brought from these other cities to the police headquarters in Timbuktu. Al-Hasan himself also says this. The evidence will show that Al-Hasan interrogated suspects and he prepared the report submitted to the tribunal. The evidence will also show that these reports had a significant impact on the judgments issued by the tribunal. His reports set out his summary of the facts, his classification of the cases into different categories, and the result of his investigations. And these reports were decisive factors in the tribunal's decisions. The evidence will show that the accused reports were relied upon by the tribunals who used them for their summary judgments. The tribunal needed these reports to decide their cases. The short duration of their so-called hearings and the result of the decisions themselves show how the tribunal relied on the results of Al-Hasan's investigation reports. For instance, in one case, when Al-Hasan's report indicated that a person confessed to adultery, this confession was the main reason to find the person guilty, and that person was sentenced to 100 lashes, whilst without a confession, victims could receive, and usually did receive, less than 100 lashes. And my colleague tomorrow, Mr. Musa Alafi, will provide examples to your honours to show this close connection between the reports written by the accused, the tribunal decisions, and the sanctions and punishments that followed. Al-Hasan referred many cases to the tribunal, knowing full well they would result in acts underpinning the charges, including floggings and other corporal punishments, and detention for cases including adultery, theft, use and sale of alcohol and cigarettes. Al-Hasan was also critically involved in the tribunal proceedings and the sanctions they imposed. He and other police members were actively involved in organising and executing the sanctions meted out by the police or decided by the tribunal. As you've heard, he personally flogged victims who violated their rules. One witness, P65, stated, and I quote, "The Islamic police was often in charge of organising executions of sentences, and I often saw Al-Hasan in charge of them." The same witness goes on to say, "There was not a single event of execution of sentence in Timbuktu that I attended where Al-Hasan was not present." End of quote. Al-Hasan and his subordinates transferred suspects to the tribunal's hearings and to the places where the sanctions were publicly executed. In the next slide, Your Honours, this is screenshots of a video, and you can see Al-Hasan in the first image with whip in hand in the first, and in the second image, you see him actually whipping one of the victims. You will see this video footage again, Your Honours, a clearer image, as my colleague Ms. Kokuyo will show you these locations and the video footage, actual footage of this event. In the next slide, it's a screenshot of it's a screenshot from a photograph. This is of a flogging for adultery. Here you can see the accused standing very close to a female victim who was about to be flogged for adultery. There were actually 6 victims who were flogged that same day, and the evidence will show that actually several of the men involved, seen in this and other images from this event, were members of the police. And there are other examples, and you will see them in the course of the trial. And Al-Hasan also had a key role to play in complaints and disputes. The inhabitants had to deal with him in the numerous civil cases that he decided. Witnesses will testify that they were directed to the accused or summoned by him, and insiders will confirm that he handled numerous disputes. In this next screenshot from a video, you see and you will hear evidence that the accused is resolving a debt dispute concerning the purchase of weapons. And you see weapons on the table before them. The accused also personally intervened in very personal aspects of the inhabitants' lives, such as marital disputes. For instance, you will hear evidence, including from Insider Witness 150, that Al-Hasan was known to pressure women to return to husbands whom they had either left or wanted to divorce. In this next slide, this is a report, again written by the accused, about a man wanting his wife to be returned to him. And you see his signature again on this report. There were other ways that the accused had an impact on people's lives. He had a say, for example, whether they could dig a well or whether a journalist could do their work and how they could do their work. And the fact that he had this power to issue permits and such authorizations also shows how important he was and his influence on the daily life of Timbuktu's inhabitants. In this next slide, Your Honour, you see an authorization for digging a well signed by the accused with the Islamic police stamp at the bottom of it. He signed, in this case, in the name of the Emir of the police, again with the stamp of the Islamic police.
Merci beaucoup.
Judge Mendua, thank you very much, Ms. Looping, for your statement. We have reached the end of the first day of the hearing. We shall adjourn for today, and we shall resume tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock with the rest of the opening statements on the part of the Office of the Prosecutor. The hearing is adjourned.